Generally, the end of the Virgin Mary's life is a bit of a conundrum theologically, because there's no account of it in the New Testament. And very unusually, compared with other saints whose relics were often used and celebrated and distributed in the Christian church, there are no relics of the Virgin Mary, and also no agreed tradition about where she was buried. There are ideas it might have been in Jerusalem or in Ephesus. So there's a sort of aura of mystery around the end of her life, which means that there's a sort of problem, but also an opportunity for the early Christian church to imagine or share traditions of how her life might have come to the end of its earthly course.
One of those apocryphal sources is known as the Transitus Mariae, or that crossing over, that Passover of Mary. And it deals with those final days of her life, her death, and her Assumption, all subjects that we're going to cover in this film. And that source was probably the source for this artist, Giotto, who is painting this altarpiece around 1310 in Florence. And he's painting it for the Church of Ognissanti. And very particularly, he's painting it for the Umiliati order, who use it specifically for saying masses for the dead. So the subject of the end of the Virgin's life here is directly connected to the functions that took place in front of this object. You can see the Virgin laid out here on a bier. She's accompanied by her 3 female companions here and surrounded by the apostles.
The fact that she might have died, that isn't going to be accepted in all strands of Christianity. And the various traditions about how she reached the end of the course of her earthly life began in the very early centuries of the Christian church in different places. And one of those traditions was that she fell asleep. And the word dormition was used for this, which literally means falling asleep. And that at that moment, she, in a state of spiritual peace and without suffering, yielded up her soul. And we see that here because that little baby-like figure is a representation of her soul being held by Christ, who of course has already ascended to heaven, but it's as though he's come down to her deathbed in order to receive that soul and take it with him to heaven.
Yes, it's such an interesting visual interpretation. You can see an artist trying to imagine, how do I represent a soul? And very early on, souls were represented as these innocent, often naked babies, that idea of that innocent soul being raised up to heaven. And of course, in this tradition, 3 days later, it's understood that the Virgin herself will be raised bodily into heaven as well, so she will join her soul.
The body catches up, as it were, with the soul. And this tradition is a part of Western Catholic tradition for many centuries, but it's also the central belief of the Orthodox churches. And both the Feast of the Dormition in Eastern churches and the more Catholic celebration of how she reaches the end of her life are celebrated on the same day, the 15th of August. But the other tradition is the one that we're going to look at now, and it's in a work in another room in the Gemälde Gallery. Well, Jenny, this was the painting I was thinking of, and it creates a strong contrast because the Giotto is very horizontal, the Virgin's body laid out in that fashion. But here, there's a much more sort of vertical impetus, isn't there? There's a sense of upward movement as well as a more vertical composition. And that's because we're looking at a representation of what's called the Assumption, which describes the moment when the Virgin body and soul is assumed, in other words, elevated, taken up into heavenly glory.
Yes, this work is such a good contrast with that Giotto, which had, as you say, the Virgin laid out on that funerary bier. That tradition that Giotto is drawing on, the Transitus Mariae, describes her that way, but I think he must also be drawing on another textual tradition from something called the Golden Legend, which was this compilation of the saints' lives, which was written in the 13th century and used for many centuries afterwards. Because if you go back and read about the end of the Virgin's life in that text, it is described how the apostles, which were all over the world, were miraculously brought together at her bedside at the end of her life. Which is why they were there
in the Giotto, weren't they?
Exactly. Yeah. And I think this artist, Andrea del Castagno, was probably also reading the Golden Legend. And there it's described how the Virgin was assumed out of her tomb, and that's what we can see at the center of this composition, up into heaven. And in the Golden Legend, we also have the description of the flowers that appeared in her tomb. So when she disappeared, the flowers appeared. And it specifically mentioned roses, as we see here, and lilies, which are flowers which are associated with the Virgin. But in that text, it's also described the beautiful perfumes that were emitted. We know that this work was commissioned for a church in Florence in the 1440s. The church is called San Miniato fra le Torri. It doesn't exist any longer, so not to be confused with the other San Miniato al Monte. And as you can see here, we don't have the apostles gathered around the tomb. In fact, the composition is distilled somewhat. We have the angels assuming her up into heaven. But we see two standing saints, very elegantly standing saints. On the left, St. Julian, and on the right, St. Minius.
Despite the presence of the tomb here, there are other very significant traditions in Western Catholicism that insist she didn't die at all. So the Assumption still happens, but it happens without her needing to die. And there are many paintings of the Assumption which have some of these elements to it, but not the tomb at all. The actual definition of this as a dogma, as something that Catholics must believe, happened really quite late in 1950. And Pope Pius XII, who declared the dogma in the end, was very careful to word it in a way that wouldn't exclude the Orthodox churches who did believe she died, and many Catholics who still do, but would allow this possibility that she didn't. So he used the phrase about how when she reached the end of the course of her earthly life, she was assumed, which leaves it open. But I think the key point is that whether she died or not, she ends up in the right place. The destination is the same. Both body and soul enter into the glory of heaven.
It's so interesting looking at the Giotto and this Andrea del Castagno together, because I'm minded of a third work in the Bode Museum collection, which combines both the deathbed of the Virgin and the Assumption as we see it here in the Andrea del Castagno. So I think we should go to the Bode right now and have a look at that work. So Ben, we've just looked at beautiful representations of the Dormition of the Virgin, of her Assumption. And here in the Bode Museum, we're looking at another representation of her death and Dormition, but also of her Assumption. And this smaller panel by Bartolomé Bermejo, painted probably in the 1460s. And what you can see here is the Virgin laying on her deathbed, and she's already being assumed here. You can see her being raised up by these four angels to God the Father. All of the apostles gathered around her bed are preparing her for this next moment of her life or her afterlife. There's one apostle here tending to the incense, another lighting candles. We have St. Peter here blessing her with a piece of hyssop.
In full ecclesiastical robes.
Yes. And rather beautifully, in the tiles on the floor, we have an inscription, a repeated inscription. It says, M Dios es. So Mary is with God.
The apostles, with their equipment and their clothing, have evoked a sense of a funeral. You know, this is almost like a church event, which so many people would have recognized then from their own experience, that this is Mary leaving this world as their own loved ones do. And in that respect too, I think the painting offers them a glimpse of what awaits their loved ones as well on the far side. Because although Mary's gone ahead, in a sense, both her soul and her body already standing glorified in heaven, and the rest of us must wait for that moment. Nevertheless, it's a promise to all righteous ones that we too eventually will stand with her in that blaze of glory which we see Bermejo conjuring up for us so beautifully here, and being welcomed into the embrace of God.